Welcome to the Climate Policy Initiative webinar, Tracking Finance for Electricity and Clean Cooking Access in High-Impact Countries, presented by Cameron Carswell, analyst at CPI, Vivian Foster, Global Lead for Energy Economics, Markets and Institutions at the World Bank, and Fiona Messent, Finance and Policy Specialist at Sustainable Energy for All. For those who are not familiar with Climate Policy Initiative or Sustainable Energy for All, CPI's analysts and advisors work to improve the most important energy and land use policies around the world, with a particular focus on finance. CPI supports decision makers through in-depth analysis on what's working and what's not. Sustainable Energy for All empowers leaders to broker partnerships and unlock finance to achieve universal access to sustainable energy as a contribution to a cleaner, just, and prosperous world for all. SE for All exists to reduce the carbon intensity of energy while making it available to everyone on the planet. The format of this webinar will be a half-hour presentation followed by a question and answer session. All attendees will be on mute. During this time, you're welcome to submit questions by typing them in, and we will address them after the presentation. As a reminder, the webinar is being recorded and will be available online this week. And now I will turn it over to Fiona.
Without rapid progress on SDG 7, it will be impossible to deliver on the other SDGs by 2030. So having played a core role in putting universal access to modern energy services at the heart of the SDGs, SE for All is working to help partners to take rapid and tangible action on delivering on these promises. But unlocking finance is key to actually achieving these SDGs. And in order to do this, we need a better understanding of where and how money is flowing, and to identify solutions to increase finance and accelerate the delivery of energy access solutions, particularly in high-impact countries, but all around the world. So many studies have estimated the amount of investment that's needed to meet the energy access goal, but none have attempted to systematically analyse what finance is actually being committed to energy access, what is known about the disbursement of development finance for energy access, or the challenges facing energy access enterprises in delivering modern energy services to more people more affordably. So at the UN General Assembly in September of this year, Sustainable Energy for All, with our partners, launched new research that for the first time tracks and analyses finance flows for electricity and clean cooking access in 20 high-impact countries across Africa and Asia. Those countries have significant energy access gaps, which you'll see in the coming slides. These new energizing report series that you can see on the screen here reveals that the current flows of finance for energy access and clean cooking will not achieve the global goal of delivering universal access by 2030. So the series of reports are brought together by an overarching policy paper which is authored by SE for All. That's titled Energising Finance, which offers key insights and recommendations to support governments and development finance institutions to boost finance levels and to use it more effectively to reach SDG 7. With the African Development Bank, we conducted an historical analysis of development finance commitments and disbursements for electricity in the report titled Missing the Mark. And in taking the pulse, we worked with Practical Action Consulting and E3 Analytics to conduct market-based enterprise surveys of financing needs in 5 high-impact countries, that is Kenya, Ethiopia, Bangladesh, Nigeria, and Myanmar, to understand financing flows and needs of enterprises supporting energy access for different levels, tiers 1 to 3 of the World Bank's multi-tier framework, through the deployment of decentralized electricity and clean cooking solutions. And finally, as you'll hear today, we worked with CPI and the World Bank on understanding the landscape, where we track the amount and type of international and domestic finance commitments to high-impact countries for energy access. And this includes a deep dive into the domestic finance flowing in Bangladesh, Ethiopia, and Kenya conducted by the World Bank. In both cases, we have piloted an approach to map finance commitments to the levels or tiers of energy service provided to residential customers, as defined by the World Bank's multi-tier framework. This allows us to have a sense of the quality, reliability, and affordability of these services, and get a fuller picture of where and how finance is flowing. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Cameron Carswell from CPI, who will take you through their analysis, and then to Vivian, who will take you through the World Bank analysis.
Great, thank you very much for that introduction, Fiona. And what we will talk about, as Fiona said, is the Understanding the Landscape report, which analyses investment in electricity and clean cooking in countries with the lowest levels of electricity and clean cooking access. And the report looks at the question from two perspectives. Firstly, the global approach, led by CPI, looks at investment across 20 high-impact countries, which account for the majority of those without access to electricity and clean cooking. And this aspect of the study covers the years 2013 and 2014. Secondly, the country approach, led by the World Bank, looks at three countries, Kenya, Ethiopia and Bangladesh, in much greater detail. This study covers the years 2013 to 2015, and you'll hear more on that from Vivian shortly. So let's begin by having a look at the size of the problem we're facing. As Fiona mentioned, globally 1 billion people lack access to electricity. And no electricity means no lighting and no refrigerations of foods and vaccines. It's a basic barrier to development. And as you can see from the map, of this 1 billion, approximately 80% live in the so-called high-impact countries we evaluated, and that is predominantly in sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia. The picture is even starker for clean cooking. Globally, 3 billion people lack access to clean cooking, again predominantly in sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia. Cooking with wood, charcoal and other fuels causes millions of deaths each year as people breathe polluted indoor air. So those are the number of people without access to electricity and clean cooking. The question then becomes, how much investment do we need to get them access? Many estimates exist, but at a minimum, we're looking at investment needs of $45 billion per year to 2030 for electricity. And again, at a minimum, we're looking at $4.4 billion per year to 2030 for clean cooking. Our report looked at how close actual investments are to those numbers. We estimated total finance flows across the 20 high-impact countries using a variety of data sources, which we then apportioned between residential and non-residential electricity consumers. So we'll begin by looking at some of the main findings for electricity access. And if you're viewing this on a small screen, this may not be easy to see. I recommend downloading the full report to review at your leisure. But what this diagram shows is where finance for electricity is going from and to, for what and via who. But there are a few main numbers to focus on. Firstly, on average, only $19.4 billion per year, and that is highlighted with this rather wonderful highlighter tool. Only $19.4 billion per year is being invested in electricity in the high-impact countries. This is an average across 2013 and 2014. But this number includes investment in electricity which benefits commerce, industry and residential users. For example, a grid-connected power plant will provide electricity to households, small businesses, large businesses and industry. Now, of course, investment in electricity for commerce and industry is vital for a functioning economy, but we must recognise that only a subset of this 19.4 billion figure relates to residential electricity consumption. So once we've subtracted the investment associated with commerce and industry, we are left with around 6 billion, which is highlighted there, which relates to residential electricity access. Now, if you cast your mind back to the slide a second ago, 6 billion is much less than the 45 billion annual investment figure we need to bring about universal electricity access. We are therefore well short of required investment levels. Having understood the volume of finance allocated to residential users, the next step is to understand the quality of that access. Not all electricity access is created equal. A solar lantern may provide light for a few hours a day, while a household connected to a grid-level system may be able to use multiple appliances such as televisions and refrigerators all day. This is not a criticism of solar lanterns, which can be deployed quickly and relatively cheaply, but a recognition that different levels of access do exist. Indeed, it is possible to have a low tier of electricity access with a highly unreliable grid, which is the case in many countries. But what we found across the 20 high-impact countries was that the finance tracked, or rather the bulk of finance committed, provided Tier 3 access or above. That is to say, at least 8 hours of electricity per day, with the ability to power medium wattage appliances and above. This leads us on to the next question, which is how is the electricity being generated? Perhaps unsurprisingly, grid-connected projects accounted for the lion's share of finance. As you can see from the chart, from the section, the 52% and the 20%, which I shall attempt to highlight now. So that section of the pie chart, around 70% of finance went to grid-connected electricity projects, with the residual largely spent on improving the distribution and transmission networks, i.e. the grid itself. So that, more or less, is the green sections highlighted there. However, perhaps more surprisingly, grid-connected renewable projects represented a greater share of spending tracked than fossil fuels. Grid-connected renewable electricity projects accounted for 52% of finance tracked, versus 20% of finance tracked for grid-connected fossil fuel projects. This may be part of a wider trend on which further research would be required. It's worth saying something quickly on decentralized electricity, such as mini-grids, solar home systems, and anything not plugged into the main grid. This commanded only $200 million of the finance tracked, which in the context of $19.4 billion per year is a negligible amount. Now, it's important because decentralized electricity is often the cheapest and fastest way to reach rural populations without electricity access. So that is some feel for how the numbers break across the different tiers and technology types. Now let's see how this looks across the 20 high-impact countries. In absolute terms, India was the largest recipient of finance, which we'd probably expect given its size. And typically, electricity finance accounted for between 0.25% and 2% of GDP in the countries we looked at. However, in 12 of 20 countries, finance commitments for electricity were less than 1% of GDP. This chimes with the finding that electricity investment is falling short of the levels required. Now, those are some of the main findings from our report on electricity. For reasons of time, it is not possible to go into all of the conclusions, but hopefully that gives you a flavour. There are, of course, other findings on sources, the instruments used, and a host of other conclusions you will find in the full report. But now we will move on to finance for clean cooking. And as before, on a small screen, this diagram will not be the easiest to interpret, but again, what we're saying, starting on the left-hand side over here is the sources and the providers, then we're moving through to the instruments through which the funds were dispersed here, and so on through geography, recipients and uses, and finally through to this number here, which is the most important number on the page, the 32 million figure. And the key point here is that only 32 million excuse me, in annual finance for clean cooking was identified across the 20 high-impact countries. Now, this falls massively short of the estimated $4.4 billion per year required to bring about universal clean cooking access. Current investment is less than 1% of the minimum estimated amount required. Or to put it another way, current spending amounts to less than $1 per person per year across the high-impact countries. And for comparison, an improved biomass cook stove can cost $40 alone. So if we look at the tiers of cooking access granted, most investment delivered Tier 3 clean cooking access. And just a quick word on tiers again. The tiers of cooking access are drawn along similar lines to those of electricity. It's a question of the quality of access delivered. What is the cook stove efficiency? How easy is it to acquire the fuel? And what is the improvement to indoor air quality, and so on. And it is worth noting from this table that the highest tier of access we have is Tier 3, and that none of the finance we tracked would be expected to produce Tier 5 clean cooking access, which would imply the lowest level of indoor air pollution. And of the little finance we did track, countries in sub-Saharan Africa were the main recipients. commanding the lion's share. Countries in Southeast Asia received relatively little finance by comparison, although at this point it is worth saying a word on data limitations. With certain countries, the data simply wasn't there, or was there to a very limited extent, so no significant data was found on clean cooking for North Korea, Myanmar, or the Philippines. And so the final slide we have on the global approach before we move on to Vivian's country level studies is to look at the sources of clean cooking finance. In terms of the sources we tracked, international public money, as you can see from the chart, they're accounted for by far and away the largest share at 81%. There was some small international private money, 12%, which was largely philanthropy from the US. And as you can see at the top there, the 6% domestic, or 6.2% I should say, was a very small share of the total. However, again, it is worth emphasizing that small-scale clean cooking transactions may not necessarily be picked up by some of the databases and sources. But it is also worth saying that while our findings on cooking were perhaps partly limited by lack of data, it is important to emphasize that total finance appears to be falling well short of the requirement. So again, that is a rapid-fire tour of some of the key conclusions from the cooking side of the report. And again, there is much more available in the full report itself, which is available on the SE for All website. At this point, I will now hand over to Vivian, who will talk through some of the country findings in more detail. You will tell that this is actually Cameron, not Vivian, but while we try and resolve technical issues, I will speak to her slides as best I can. So to reiterate slightly, the report was broken into basically two approaches, which, as I said, was the CPI approach, which looked at things at a global level, or at the 20 high-impact countries, and then the World Bank had a more detailed look at three countries, the first of which was Kenya. Now, as you can see from this diagram, or again, depending on your screen size, is that on the left-hand side we have the sources of countries, sources of finance rather, and predominantly outside Kenya with a small domestic amount. And then as we move through, I think the key point to recognise is that almost all finance, materially speaking, was channeled through the government before ultimately being moved on to utilities, state-owned enterprises, other project developers, independent power producers, and then through to, again, as with the high-impact countries' conclusions, it's primarily grid-connected generation capacity with a lesser focus on transmission and distribution, i.e. upgrading of the grid itself. And again, if we look here, findings more or less in accordance with what we found in the 20 high-impact countries study is that non-residential receives, we've got 646 million per year versus 440, so roughly 60-40 in favour of non-residential recipients. And then tiers of access, tier 3 and above, again commanding the lion's share of finance, with relatively negligible levels of finance for tiers 1 and 2, which again suggests a predominance of grid-connected electricity assets.
Slide, and you'll see first of all that the numbers are very, very much lower, only 7 million per year versus 1 billion that we were talking about on the previous slide. Kenya, we found, actually had one of the most developed financing arrangements for clean cooking of the three countries that we looked at, and there's clearly two major segments. On the top half of the chart you can see public grants, a mixture of coming from Kenya itself, but also from international multilateral donors, going primarily through the government and providing grants for biogas installations primarily. And then in the lower half of the chart, you can also see the beginnings of a sort of private sector cooking market with a number of bilaterals, particularly the UK and the US, channeling funds through a mixture of government and corporates, to provide corporate debt to companies that are investing to provide cook stoves. So that's quite an interesting and quite relatively developed set of institutional arrangements for financing to clean cooking. Let's turn now to Ethiopia and the electricity sector, where the aggregate level of funding again is a little over $1 billion a year. And perhaps the most striking thing about Ethiopia is on the far left bottom corner, you'll see that the international multilateral institutions play a much smaller role than they did in Kenya. The government of Ethiopia remains quite important, but really it's the Chinese bilateral aid that is really by far the largest contributor that we've found in the case of Ethiopia. Chinese aid is channeled partly through government channels, but also through export promotion agencies. And a lot of it is taking the form of either project debt or corporate debt, as you can see further over to the right in the gray column. So a lot of it is finding its way directly to the utility SOEs in the form of project and corporate debt without being intermediated by the government of Kenya. We also found that not all of this debt finance was concessional in nature, as was the case in Kenya, but there was a higher balance of non-concessional finance. Once again, the investment shows a strong 60 or 40 type of split between non-residential and residential, although in the case of Ethiopia, we did find a higher preponderance of tiers 1, 2, and 3 in terms of where the investment is ultimately going. If we turn to the cooking sector in Ethiopia, you'll see how simple it appears relative to the Kenya story that we just looked at. Again, it's very small at an aggregate of 12 million. And it's almost entirely in the form of bilateral aid from the Netherlands being channeled through the government in the form of grants and subsidies to develop primarily biogas installations. So a very, very nascent market there in Ethiopia for cooking. Finally, we turn to Bangladesh, which was a little higher in the income tiers than the two African countries we just looked at. And one of the differences that stands out, as you'll see in the far left there, is that a much higher share, almost half of the financing for electricity, is coming from the government itself, the government of Bangladesh. And most of the remainder is coming through multilateral sources, a much smaller role for the bilateral donors. The aggregate level of finance at over $5 billion a year is much, much higher than what we were seeing in either Kenya or Ethiopia. And we see there particularly, once again, a concentration of the funding going through the utilities in the purple column in the middle. And it's a mixture of budget transfer resources, but also loans being made directly to the utility. And to some extent, using a significant amount of balance sheet financing, using the utility's own equity as a basis for raising capital, which we did not see in either of the African countries. So this shows perhaps a further degree of development. And then once again, the bulk there of the funds benefiting the non-residential sector and in the residential sector, primarily tier 3, although Bangladesh, of course, does have a well-developed off-grid program, and for that reason, you see a certain amount of funding going there to tier 1 and 2. Finally, if we look at the cooking sector for Bangladesh, again, a very, very, relatively small and less than $1 million a year were identified, and basically either international money being used as grants going to market support primarily, or quite a lot of activity in terms of families putting forward capital to support companies, private companies that are providing wood cook stoves. So again, a very, very small and relatively underdeveloped financing ecosystem for cooking in Bangladesh. So to conclude, let's compare the results across the three countries for electricity. We see here how Bangladesh at over 5 billion was substantially beyond what Ethiopia and Kenya were able to raise. But in GDP terms, relatively consistent between 2 to 3% of GDP in all three across the three countries, which is actually a very substantial commitment to the electricity sector. We see that the share coming from domestic finance at over 40% in Bangladesh is almost twice as much as what Ethiopia and Kenya were able to provide domestically. We see that Kenya benefited from 100% concessional finance for electricity, whereas in the other countries it was more like 60, 65%. And you can see there in Bangladesh a higher share going to off-grid, about 4%, but overall about 35 to 40% of funding going to residential users. And finally, comparing the cooking numbers, you can see how tiny they are, measured in millions rather than billions, and negligible in per capita terms. And in terms of the share coming from domestic sources, about 30% in Bangladesh and Kenya, but zero in Ethiopia. And quite a high prevalence of the funding being channeled towards biogas facilities. Thank you very much. I'd like to hand it back to my colleagues.
Thank you. We will now take questions. If you would like to ask a question, please type it in the box in the right corner. Our first question is, what type of finance flows were taken?
I suppose I'll come in on that first, and then I think Vivian will probably have a little more to say on the domestic side of things. And the short answer is basically as much as possible. So any kind of private or public debt, equity, grant, anything that flows through DFIs, purely private investors, philanthropists, and everything in between, and that's captured through a combination of various databases and surveys of the kind of the DFIs. But I wonder, Vivian, if you want to say anything more on the domestic side of things.
Yes, absolutely, and I'll respond in particular to the question from Angela. So first of all, I think it's fair to say that not all data was equally available to us. And so when we aggregate the results, we may be obviously overrepresenting available data relative to unavailable. However, I would say that for the country case studies, the public sector budget data was relatively straightforward to get. And I think we have a pretty high degree of confidence that we obtained that information because it's centralized through the government. Where we struggled more was with the private sector, partly because they were small and atomized, but partly also because the information was regarded as commercially sensitive, so they weren't always willing to share. So the private side, I think, is under measured probably in the country cases. And similarly, anything to do with the off-grid dispersed electrification, we do think the numbers are definitely very small, but they're probably a bit bigger than we were able to capture, partly because of the additional challenges associated with that. And finally, just to clarify that the numbers presented were based on extensive on-the-ground fieldwork with people working in the countries, visiting all the relevant institutions, interviewing them, collecting accounts, and integrating the information into a standardized data template. Thank you.
Our next question is, did you look further into what type of cooking? Did you look at photovoltaic for cooking or only cook stoves?
It's a good question. I think at the high impact country level, so the global approach, we were guided by what we saw in the data. And in that, we did not see any material amount, I don't think, of photovoltaics for cooking. We primarily saw biogas digesters accounted for a good chunk of the expenditure, and improved biomass stoves were probably a decent amount of the residual, with some LPG in there. I think there's a chart in the full report. So we didn't really look at photovoltaics for cooking very much, simply because we didn't see it to a great extent in the data. And Vivian, I don't think that was any different.
That is correct. And in fact, I think what was striking about the technologies that came through on the cooking side was the preponderance of biogas in the numbers, the financing numbers, with biomass cook stoves as a sort of second category. But those were the only two technologies that we encountered.
We have a question for Cameron. Is the energy access financing commitment chart one of the channels is unknown, but it counts almost 50% of the financing channel? Is there a gap of information?
I think the short answer there is yes. I think you're probably referring to the chart at the beginning where we have about 9 billion of public money and about 3 billion of private, and then the balance is attributed to unknown. And I suppose it just sort of speaks to the data. So for a given piece of data, we might have information on the tier and the technology, but not necessarily the channeling entity. So it doesn't necessarily mean that sort of 50% of data is missing throughout the data set. It's just a sort of specific subset, sort of section of the data in terms of the channel through which finance is going. So if we may know it came from a certain bilateral institution, but we may not know which channel it was ultimately went through. So yes, I suppose the short answer is that that's kind of a
we have time for a few more questions. Oh, this one just came in. How can I place the role of photovoltaics on your agenda? I have a working solution waiting for global spread.
It's a good question. I mean, I think sort of in this exercise we are very much guided by the data. You know, the report is very much reporting what is out there in the world. But I suppose, Fiona, it'd probably be good to get your thoughts.
Yeah, I agree. Part of this exercise was really to determine what data is out there, where the gaps are, and so if part of it is identifying new data sources, then we would very much welcome that for any future iterations of this, and we're currently exploring the options for doing future iterations of the landscape. So we'd certainly appreciate any more data.
Perhaps I can also mention that the solar is showing up in two places in the data. One is on the grid-connected renewables, which, as you saw from Cameron, was really the largest one of the larger categories of finance. So a significant proportion, or some proportion of that would be solar at least. And the other is in the off-grid decentralized, which is where we feel that we're probably struggling to fully capture what's going on.
Did the availability of multilateral development bank green finance programs in a particular country influence the results?
I suppose yes and no. I think in certain countries the volume of finance compared to wider finance that was not channeled through multilateral development banks rather, that ratio was such that it wouldn't skew the results too much. So I mean, it's a country by country question. Obviously, in some countries, spending from multilateral banks accounts for a good chunk of what is going in to the total finance. I mean, if I'm sort of second guessing at what might be behind the question, if we're saying, well, why are grid-connected renewables showing up as larger than fossil fuels, there are a couple of potential explanations there. One is timing. So if we look at a country like India, there were a huge number of coal-fired plants commissioned before 2013-14, which might have come online during that period, but which were not captured just by dint of the methodology, essentially. So that doesn't mean those coal plants aren't being built. It just means they don't show up in these numbers to the same extent. And the other one is potential questions around how much domestic finance have we captured, and is there any shortfall there which might, if it was captured, boost the fossil fuel number, because we think our coverage of sort of international, multilateral development bank money is pretty good, but potentially there are some gaps on the domestic side, and that might explain some of the difference between grid-connected renewable energy projects and grid-connected fossil fuel projects. I hope that answers the question.
Just to complement, I think it's also relevant to note the consistency with other sources of information. So REN21, Bloomberg, and others have been saying for the last 2-3 years that the share of new capacity that's coming from renewable sources is now higher than the share of capacity that's coming from fossil fuel resources, and that's true globally. So I think our findings are somewhat consistent with that broader trend.
Great, thank you. Another question is, in off-grid decentralized, could we not have larger capacity systems to include cooking?
I mean, again, I think that question certainly makes a great deal of sense. What we've attempted to do is report back on the data as it is currently, and it may well be that if we were to repeat this exercise for say 2015 and 2016, in the context, decentralized, we'd see large capacity systems which included cooking. But as it is for 2013 and 14, and indeed 15 in the country studies, that wasn't necessarily showing.
What kind of conclusions would you draw from your research? Is there a need for more investment, do you think? Investment diversification.
I defer to Fiona on this one, but I suppose one of the things which did perhaps leap out at us is how little money is being spent on decentralized electricity, and that has implications for bringing electricity to those in very remote or rural communities where it's going to be either very costly or very time consuming, or both, to extend the grid to bring electricity to people who live in those regions. But I'm sure Fiona and possibly Vivian will have points.
Maybe I can come in. I also wanted to pick up another question that I don't think we covered, which was on larger capacity cooking systems from Mahesh. And I wanted to mention that another area where I think the coverage may not have been as extensive as it could be would be on LPG and gas grid connected cooking arrangements. Really, the data we were able to find was more on the cook stove biomass area. So I feel that there's probably more going on in the larger scale systems on cooking than we were able to capture. Coming back to the broader issue of the conclusions, certainly agree with what was said about the off-grid. I think the other very stark conclusion is on cooking. Clearly, we know that the cooking deficit is actually much larger than the electrification deficit, and we know that the health consequences are particularly grave, and yet the volumes of financing going into cooking were really quite pitiful compared to what we saw for electricity. So clearly that's an area of concern. I think the other interesting thing when you get to the country level is just how different the financing patterns are across countries. Some countries like Ethiopia, with its strong relationship with China, is going down one particular model. Kenya has a model that's more around multilateral collaboration. Bangladesh is obviously doing better at raising its own capital. So it shows that there are many strategies and that they maybe apply at different stages in the development of the energy sector.
Thank you. Another question is, how is friends and family project finance in Bangladesh captured in the Clean Cooking High Impact Country Finance Chart?
Maybe I can react. I think that's a reaction to the Bangladesh case study. I'm not sure how that would filter through into the global study, because that type of source of information would not be picked up in global databases. So I think maybe it's a good opportunity just to mention that the two methodologies, the top-down global review that CPI did and the bottom-up country-level data collection done by the World Bank, are complementary and don't necessarily capture all of the same things. When we compared the studies, the results of the cases for the three countries that we have, we compared the top-down and the bottom-up results on a line-by-line basis. We found actually that there was less overlap than you might expect, i.e. The bottom-up cases were picking up a lot of sources of finance that were not in the international, but also vice versa. The international review was picking up sources of finance that weren't in the domestic. So one has to be cognizant that there are different methodologies, and at the moment we're really experimenting with what you can get from doing it in each of the two ways. And I think the conclusion is that you probably need to look at both sources of information rather than just one or the other.
Thank you. We have time for one last question, which is, what are the technology challenges in these initiatives? Do you foresee any advanced technology can help this financial cap?
I'll speak quickly on this, and then it'd be good to get Fiona and Vivian's perspective as well. I think when it comes to technology, the main question is going to be cost always, and how cost competitive these are. This is in the case of electricity with existing, existing solutions. And then in the case of mini grids, again, it's a question of cost, and is it possible to have a sort of anchor electricity consumer, which makes it possible for the mini grid to be financially viable. I appreciate that's not strictly a technology question. And the other final point, I suppose, when you're deploying renewable technologies is battery cost. Again, battery cost to reduce the extent to which you need to rely on other systems. And then on the cooking side, again, I think the existing technology is probably there. It's more a question of deployment, and as Vivian hit upon, scaling up the investment. But it would be good to get Vivian and Fiona's perspectives as well.
I don't think I have much to add on the topic. I mean, I think obviously it's a very rapidly moving field, and as technology brings cost reductions, you know, the investment envelopes will have a bigger impact and go further. But no further observations.
I agree. I echo what both Cameron and Vivian had said. I suppose the only other thing I'd add to the previous question about investment diversification, I think exactly what Vivian and Cameron said about decentralized access is important, but also looking at integrated systems that include the last mile, I think is something that we really, this research showed we need to consider solutions that will reach those hard to reach areas to ensure that we get energy for all by 2030.
Thank you very much for your our webinar. The recorded webinar will be available on our website within 5 business days. Thank you for joining us today.